no, because of ChatGPT.
I'm not on. Okay, yeah, we are on. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this first breakout session of today, where we're going to talk about generative AI, the promises and perils of generative AI. My name is Bertin Martens. I'm a research fellow at Bruegel. And we have a nice panel here today. First of all, we have Hinda Hanet, who's a professor of data science at the University of Amsterdam, but she's also scientific co-director of the Civic AI Lab. She's founder of Owls and Arrows, a company specialized in data science, and she has many other hats, actually. Second is Jeremy Rollinson, who is the Director of EU Government Affairs at Microsoft here in Brussels. He focuses on cloud policies and many other digital policy issues in the digital single market. Prior to joining Microsoft, he worked for Nokia. And before that, he worked for the European Digital Media Association here in Brussels. And last but not least, we have Kai Zenner, who is assistant to MEP Axel Voss of the European People's Party. He is well known, I think, in Brussels circles for being the lead assistant and the main driver force behind the development of the AI Act. He came out in Politico's ranking of Brussels power makers in the 13th place for MEP assistants. That's really an achievement. So we really wanted to have him here. And of course, he is the token representative for the whole regulatory community on AI. So what I would like to do here this morning is, first of all, I will ask our panel members a few questions. I'll start with Hinda and then to Jeremy and then to Kai in the end. I hope you can answer these questions in about 5 minutes or so that we can also have a second round of questions. And then we'll move to the audience and to Slido. As you saw in the opening session, you can ask questions on Slido. The Slido code for this session is at generative AI. So if you type that into your Slido app, you can ask questions. And once we finish the question round to the speakers, I'll select a few questions and ask them to the speakers. So without further ado, generative AI burst onto the scene about a year or so ago. Of course, in academic circles, it was known much longer before that. And I think it's not an overstatement to say that over the last year or so, it has been the hype in the digital world. The question is whether that hype turns into a real economic, social reality, or whether it will peter out at some point and the next hype is already waiting in the background to come up. We have this, I think, slightly ambiguous attitude towards generative AI, because on the one hand, we want it to make us more productive, to do things that we cannot do as human beings. But on the other hand, we are afraid of it. We are afraid that it will take our jobs. We are afraid that it will become general intelligence and that it will surpass us in intellectual capacities and that we will just become bystanders in the history of the world. So in this debate, we will try to develop these paradoxical or conflicting poles of AI. Hinda, let me first turn to you. These generative AI foundation models are very costly to run. At the moment, you can still run them maybe for a few million euros, but next generation AI models will cost tens or maybe even hundreds of millions. And so the question is, are we climbing an exponential growth path? And if that is so, who can afford to stay on that growth path? Small AI startups or even academics universities have a hard time keeping up with this. Will this mean that AI will be increasingly monopolized by very large companies, that academia can no longer get involved in this? Will this push AI into profitable areas at the expense of public interest domains? How do you look at this?
That's a great question. And I think it definitely raises, we definitely seen this risk and we've seen it happen, right? I like the way Kate Crawford, who is an AI researcher, puts this. She says that AI is kind of split between these houses of AI, right? These big companies that can actually afford to develop these type of models and also benefit from them. But they also kind of dictate what's available to us as academics, as industry practitioners, and that really raises the risk of, yeah, are we going to be left behind? As academics, clearly we don't have the type of budget that would be required to develop and deploy these kind of tools. And from the industry perspective, we have the same issue, right? Like, so the way I think about this is the status of things, right? We have a few companies that are actually able to develop these models. Now what we need to think about is, should we enter this race, right? Are we actually going to gain anything from it? So when we think about foundational models, we see this hype of, yes, they're going to help in the medical field, they're going to help in the legal field, they're going to create jobs, they're going to maybe replace jobs. But if you really think about how it's being used and what the limitations are, in terms of quality of data, quality of the content generated, what it actually requires in terms of costs, but also environmental costs to run these models, do we actually want to necessarily embark on that race, right? So what are the real kind of, let's say, top 5 things that we want as Europeans, let's say, if we want to develop this type of models? If we look at it really from a specific type of, what are the outcomes? What kind of jobs do we want to create from this? Or what kind of problems are we going to solve, right? When you think about the medical field, there is a lot of buzz and fuzz about, yeah, AI is going to help at this, do this and that. But the reality is that a lot of the AI that's developed in the healthcare domain is not functional. It's just not usable by hospitals, it's not usable by healthcare providers. So it's important to understand that this is an opportunity, but also we need to think about what are the domains that really need it and how are we going to use it, right? Right now, I think like the biggest hit for ChatGPT, because I think that's what we talk about when we talk about foundation models, is marketing, right? Like if you're a marketer, this has really changed your life as a marketer. It has maybe made your job more fun if you have to write copies or write content for emails, for personalization, for these things that you get to get discounts, etc. It really makes it easier, right? So it generates content, it helps with creativity, but when we think about what it can actually do in other domains, I think we still need to think about, or research still needs to happen there. Like we still need to get the right data. There are a lot of constraints in terms of what we can use in terms of data, patient data, to make this model generalizable and actually useful for particular use cases. So I guess, yes, it is being kind of dominated by a few companies. That's a danger, but we also need to think about, if we also want to dominate, what would we do with it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jeremy, you work for Microsoft, one of the companies that has been in the forefront of the development of this generative AI. It has given a big boost to your stock market valuation, of course. But the question is, can you really turn this also into a business model? Now, Microsoft has used it to give a new lease of life to its Bing search engine. You built it into your Microsoft Office and Teams software. And we see other business models coming up, like companies that have foundational models, opening them up for hire, for smaller companies to develop their own specific applications on top of these foundation models. So my question is, will foundation AI models become the next sort of operating system with an app store on top of it? Is that where we should see the future of digital services?
It's a great question. I certainly hope we're successful at rolling this out. I think it's a lot of excitement at the moment, and there are a lot of exciting applications that we already have announced, and we are rolling out some of the ones that you mentioned. The latter part of the question, to the extent that this would become an operating system, I don't know if we're there yet. I think there's something to be said for that, but I think we are getting to a point where, AI increasingly kind of equals software. Software will be AI. It's not just going to be a segment, but all things software, all things digital are going to increasingly have an AI element to that, whether it's foundation model powered generative AI, or there's many, many other applications too. I think it's certainly grabbed a lot of attention over the past 6 to 9 months, understandably so. This is getting into the hands of consumers now. You're seeing the reality of it. You're being able to improve your timeliness around tasks. And we're really excited about it, but we don't minimize some of the challenges and some of the fears, even some of the ones that you had just mentioned and some of the ones that regulators are capturing. I think we firmly believe this still needs to stay under human control. There needs to be safety brakes built into this. It needs to be serving humans rather than obviously the other way around. And there's a number of ways that you can do that through some of the rules that we've been discussing here in the EU, rules that are under discussion even at global level now in G7 contexts and the like. We do think this is going to be, as I said, increasingly part of so many software and digital applications across different industries. I manage the EU policy team in our office, and that's everything from trade and sustainability to, of course, digital topics and files. But we're just seeing this pop up everywhere, whether it's sustainability and AI, it's trade and AI, some of the geopolitical implications of this. So we really think it's going to be a fundamental technology, and it's getting ramped up very, very quickly. The way that it's successfully monetized, some of the jury is still out on that. We're going to have to see customer interest. And it's important to remember, we'll only be successful if our customers see the efficiency and the value in this, if our consumer, enterprise, customers across the board. And there'll be a lot of competition. Some of the challenges I think you see in the models, competition can be a helpful way of addressing some of that. The best model will ultimately be more accurate, it'll be more reliable, more trustworthy, and you're going to see hopefully a lot of competition around that space. I think we are excited about the enterprise rollout of this with generative AI in particular. I'm certainly looking forward to the day that I can ask one of the generative AI services to create a PowerPoint deck for me, and that's really just around the corner. And I think it's important to remember, we talk about replacing of tasks and the like. I've noticed and been excited about the way that it improves the time it takes me to do a task. A task that would have taken an hour, I can now do in 10 minutes thanks to generative AI. But I never go home 50 minutes earlier. It's freeing up time to do other things. And it's a good example of where you want to stay in control of this. I think those that will be most successful are those who understand the technology, but understand it well enough to use it efficiently and to check it and to make sure that you're identifying and aware of where some of the inaccuracies may be. This is going to have bugs, there's going to be mistakes. We talk sometimes about even the hallucinations and the mistakes that are made in many of the models. And it's not one straightforward answer. It matters a lot, what data sets you're leveraging for this, how the models are trained, how they're being used, how they're being deployed. But we are seeing a big ecosystem emerge around that. And I think that gets a little bit back to your question about the applications that can be built on top of this. And I think there's a lot of things to be excited about there.
Thank you very much. Kai, you have been in the forefront of the regulators' response to these new technologies, these AI technologies. And you have been very active in developing the AI Act that the Commission proposed. You have even been very active in adding this famous Article 28B to the AI proposals, because the AI Act originally, as submitted by the Commission, did not take into account generative AI models, because at the time they were not really on the radar screen of policymakers. And so Kai has been in the forefront of adding specific provisions to the AI Act to deal with this. Now, when we talk to small startups in this domain, we hear often that they say, well, these are very onerous obligations on us. They're costly for us. Providing all the documentation, all the testing is really costly. How do you respond to that? Is there a risk that this overburdening regulation is going to push AI research out of Europe and into other parts of the world? And then second question related to that is all these additional obligations of monitoring and documenting and testing systems in Article 28B, do they really make a difference compared to what was already in the original AI Act, where high-risk AI systems already had to do a number of these things? So what is the value added of Article 28B?
It's a very complex question, so I need to answer in several layers. So first of all, the European Parliament was really looking at foundation model generative AI very much from a competition perspective. So we talked about it in question number 2 already, that there is this possibilities that generative AI, let's take now ChatGPT as a product, is really building some new alternative platforms, then offering what we see already, a lot of different apps on top of ChatGPT and so on and so on. And we as European Parliament were thinking, we don't want to repeat mistakes that we did in the past when it came to, let's call it platform 1.0. And we want to help that all the different actors, market actors in the AI value chain are working better with each other, and that the flow of information is accelerated, so that especially the downstream actors really receive enough information in order to be in the AI Act, for example, in the end, compliant with Article 10, because it's those actors that are potentially falling under a high-risk classification. The foundation models came out, and as you said, it's true, they were not really fitting in the AI Act, because the AI Act is, as you know, a product safety legislation, is focusing on intended purpose, and foundation models, as we all know, do not have it. ChatGPT is already a little bit more narrow than GPT-4, the model behind it, but it's still, you can say it has a lot of purposes, potential purposes. And then the original idea that was indeed coming from EPP and Renew actors was, after strong consultation with Microsoft, but also digital SME, smaller companies, startups, to have a very narrow approach, focus on a few powerful models, and make sure that those models that are serving for many, many, many downstream companies as a kind of building block, for those few models, make sure that they are safe enough, well understood, and so on and so on. But then, politics came on the table, and therefore, as you always know, in the European Parliament, there are a lot of different perspectives. AI is also seen very differently. Some see it as a big risk, others as a big opportunity. And with that in mind, Article 28b became bigger, bigger, bigger. The scope became bigger, and all foundation models are now included, not only, like I said, the most powerful models, and also the requirements were growing, were extended, and so on. Because, like, for example, the Greens said those models are requiring huge compute, therefore it's important to put some sustainability requirement in. Others were focusing on data governance and so on. So what I'm saying is that, unfortunately, based on this first drafting seen in the parliament, it became too much, in my opinion, too big. And your point with the SMEs, I fully support at the moment that a lot of startups would fall under 28b. It's really not what we want, because a company like Microsoft in the end would be able to be compliant with 28b, I think, to a large extent at least. But a startup from Austria that is just starting with their foundation model, with their first steps, they will be completely overburdened with those requirements. And based on this, our hope now as EPP, but I think Commission and Council are rather supportive, is really to limit the scope of this 28b again, and going back a little bit to this original idea that we had to have it just for the most powerful models. And with that, we are, I think, going in a very similar direction that what now happened in the United States, where it's a code of conduct, but where also certain minimum criteria for the most powerful models like Claude, like GPT-4, and so on, were set.
Okay, thank you. By the way, for the audience, the Slido is open. I don't see any questions appearing, but please feel free to introduce your questions in Slido. But you can, of course, also ask questions afterwards. In that, turning back to you, a lot of your work is focused on responsible AI, on fairness in AI, on trying Making sure, I would almost say, trying to make sure that these AI models are better than we are as human beings. We discriminate, we are biased, we are easily misled over many things. It's already very difficult for traditional AI models to make sure that they are not biased and that they don't discriminate. For foundation models, this is even far more difficult. As Kai said, they are like plasticine. You can push them around, you can do an awful lot of things with this. How can you test this? How can you make sure, as a computer scientist or a data scientist, that they run in the direction that you want them to run?
That's a great question. So I guess there are two schools right now, right? Like there is the school that says, well, we need to do rigorous testing. So if we're going to use a foundational model for a particular task, we need to have some ground truth. We need to test if it makes sense before we can actually deploy it. So basically the fix is technical, right? Like we have the same way we test for what you call in traditional AI. For example, if you're using machine learning to predict to help, for example, the municipality of Brussels where to put most of their resources, for example, in art or support in art. If you're going to use machine learning for that, based on information about population, etc., you could still encounter bias because your machine learning is only going to be as good as your data. So we have this kind of school of thought that says, well, there are technical fixes. So we build the models, we deploy them, we observe how they behave, and then if we see that there is some bias, so by bias we mean errors, we also mean that certain groups are going to be treated differently. They're gonna not get as many positive outcomes as other groups just because, you know, bias that exists in our society. So you can think of women, you can think of folks from ethnic minorities that will maybe get less support if you automate that type of process. So the idea there is, yeah, we can fix it. We can fix it technically. So we can improve the algorithms and we can reassign outcomes in a different way. The other school of thought is, well, actually, when you design these models, when you design these algorithms, you need to think about potential biases. You need to first ask yourself, do we actually need to use machine learning to do a task like assigning, you know, grants or allocations for art or for citizen for this or that purpose? And that's slightly different, and it's not necessarily, let's say, an approach that's based on building AI at any cost, but it's really about, it's also not against building AI, it's just about really investing in a thoughtful design process, like best practices. This is what we do when we run a company that uses data or develops algorithms. We have best practices in place, right? We test, we overtest, we make sure that the data that we have is of a good quality. But if our data isn't great, it's not something that's going to stop us. It means that we're going to be extra careful at every step of our development process. And in this kind of line of thinking, what you do is you slightly slow down the process. And that's what people have trouble with. Like they feel like, oh, you're slowing down innovation, you're slowing down AI. I don't know if you're aware what happened in the Netherlands a few years back. I think it's a nice example to explain that sometimes using AI is not necessarily the answer. So our tax office has used a so-called AI system to decide who should be investigated for fraud. So what happened is, well, the data was biased, the model didn't have very careful design, and they ended up discriminating against folks that were from ethnic minorities. That was a huge scandal in the Netherlands, and actually the Dutch government had to step down as kind of an apology. So it is, a national crisis. It has cost us a lot of money to kind of compensate the folks that were wrongly accused of theft or of getting money unlawfully. We had a government that stepped down, which created also political instability, and we had to reorganize the elections. So when you think about how AI saves money for that task, because that was the premise, right? If we use AI for fraud detection, we're going to save money on all these people that are actually, taking money from the state, and they shouldn't, they're not allowed to, or they're not, eligible for it. So whatever money we saved by automating that process, we lost in the fact that we didn't check for bias, we didn't have due diligence in the way we selected the models that we were working with, we didn't think about whether we actually needed AI for that task. So this is, let's say, the second school of thought. And what I would think will be ideal is to still use AI, still use these models, but do it very carefully. There are a lot of things that are being developed right now to help us do that. Microsoft, for example, they have this great website about responsible AI where you have this thing called impact assessment forms. So it's basically a list of questions that you can go through with your teams to see if you're complying with very different values or pillars of responsible AI, like fairness, transparency, etc. So the tools that are out there, most of them are open source and freely available. So I guess the answer to the question is, the best way to make sure that we are using these things, or these models responsibly, is to look at the way we're working and to kind of demystify, the promise and the potential of AI. Is a technology like any other. We just need to be careful with it, and we need to adopt best practices.
Okay. Jeremy, coming back to you, to Microsoft. These generative AI models are very data voracious. They need enormous amounts of data. And Microsoft, thanks to its Bing search engine, already crawled the whole internet and collected all these web pages and has an enormous amount of data in-house. And Microsoft actually shared some of these data with smaller search engines. Nowadays, of course, we see people claiming, hey, but these web pages are our web pages, and we have some rights, we have copyright on the content, and there are our pictures on these web pages, and our movies, and our music. And so this whole debate on copyright is coming up. Now we see bigger companies like Microsoft and Google going to the rights holders, and we read about Google going to Getty Images and saying, okay, you have millions of pictures, give us a license to use this to train our models, and we'll pay you for that. Again, for startups, this would be very, very difficult. They don't have those deep pockets. There's also the question on copyright, not only on the input side in AI models, but also on the output side. Generative AI can generate new pictures that look very much alike existing pictures. They can generate new music that sounds very much like existing music. They can generate the voice and imitate the voice of an actor or a singer. And so that singer said, hey, this is my voice. I have some rights over this voice. But the question is, by which law do you claim that right over that voice? So how do you deal with this at Microsoft?
It's a great question. And I was really excited a few years ago to work on the copyright directive, which settled some of this in the text and data mining exception. And I would argue struck a relatively helpful compromise there. This gets more to the input side that you mentioned, and I think that's where there's been a lot of attention. I can talk about the output side in a second. I think there's going to be continued discussion on this because there's new tools that can emerge to exercise this reservation of the right or express a reservation of the right. But the EU exception on this, I think, struck a right balance, because if you don't want your content crawled for any purpose, you have that opt-out possibility. You can put that into the metadata machine-readable format to make sure that any crawler that's coming on top of that, doesn't have permission, and you would need to be approached for a license, and you can go on to that. And we thought that was a helpful balance, because you're right, these models, and in particularly this was done in the name of AI, and the commission came out and talked about the importance of establishing this for researchers, in particular, startups and others, and even for commercial purposes, because of the interest and the importance to AI. But again, it was a compromise. If you wanted to maintain, and certain business models, benefit from a licensing arrangement that they wanted to be able to maintain and control, they still have that opt-out. But for the rest, if there was no opt-out, if it's available to read, it would be available to learn from. It makes sense. There's other jurisdictions that have gone in even more progressive fashions. So the short answer is that you have tools right now that allow rights owners to protect their content. I think the discussion needs to continue, especially with the emergence of generative AI and the attention that's been gathered around from it. Are those tools sufficient? Can they be improved? And I think that's a discussion we're also happy to look into. There'll be new standards that can emerge around that instead of what is sometimes a bit binary. I think that's on the input side, where the law is a little bit clearer. On the output side, I think the law is less clear. And I think you do get into questions of moral rights and the derivative nature of things. There's all the difference in the world if I say, create a song with Madonna's voice, and then I go out and reproduce that and sell that. I mean, there's clearly infringement. But, if an artist is using some of these tools and data, perhaps, that he already belongs to him or her, and it's just simply tweaking that and using AI as a paintbrush of sorts, I think they're entitled to IP protection and copyright protection from something like that. There'll be a lot of jurisprudence, I think, that emerges there in terms of where you set those lines, and we may go backwards and forwards. I think it's less clear on the output side at the moment, but on the input side, there's been a lot of attention, and I know there's been litigation and the like that's been launched in other jurisdictions. I think it's an exciting space to watch. I think we're just starting to have that conversation, and I think it's going to continue. It's not going to go away. So I think before we rush to come in with any blunt force kind of regulatory approach, I think we need to look at it a little more broadly, because you can train these models in different ways, and there's different types of data to which you can have access. And I think it's important for rights owners to maintain control over that. And I think that's where some of the debate is right now. But I think the EU actually had a really, really good compromise with the exception that was adopted only a few years ago and has only recently been transposed. That was an important milestone for AI development in Europe, particularly for the startups and particularly for those who want to have access to all of those different publicly available sites. We think that was an important step forward, and we hope it's maintained.
Okay, thank you. Kai, coming back to what you said before on your steps or efforts in Parliament to try to limit Article 28b to bigger companies and not make it unduly burdensome for small startups. We've seen in the EU a number of regulations over the last couple of years that have this asymmetric approach. Regulations for large companies and exemptions for smaller companies. We have the Digital Services Act, that's only for very large online platforms. We have the Digital Markets Act, only for large gatekeeper platforms. And smaller ones don't have to abide by these rules. How do you see that working in practice, this two-tier approach to legislation? Does that mean that smaller AI startups can do whatever they want? Do they have to abide by copyright legislation, or can they say, well, we are exempted from all this, we can just go ahead and reproduce Madonna's voice. We are only small after all. But we know that small can very quickly become very big. So how do you think the AI Act and Article 28b could deal with this?
I would argue actually that it's a rather new approach in the European Union to have this more targeted approach, because before, let's take the GDPR, we had always very horizontal digital legislation that is trying to apply it to every sector, to every market player, and so on and so on. And based on, I would say, the assessment from many players here in the European Union, and especially in Brussels, that this is often very beneficial for the big, powerful market players, because for them it's easier to be compliant. There was this rethinking, especially in the Commission, to have this two-tier approach that you were talking about, and have maybe a stronger set of rules for those few companies that are exceptionally powerful. But as far, I'm not a big DSA expert, but as far as I understood it, DSA has also a number of rules for all companies, just what I said, an additional requirements for VLOPs and the search engines. I think personally this is the right approach, because, as I said, now going back to the GDPR, what we said that what we saw was that compliance in Germany with the GDPR really led to a situation that many, especially startups, were saying, well, for us it's too risky to. Back then it was all about big data applications and so on. And they were saying, yeah, it's huge legal uncertainty. We don't know how the French competent authority, or DPA in this case, is interpreting this paragraph. The Germans are maybe doing it like that, even though in Germany we have 16 different states that also have different interpretation. And all of this uncertainty was really not good for them, and led to many CEO decisions that they were saying, okay, better not to be involved there. And again, this is why I think now in 28b, if we are in the end really deciding for this narrow approach, it will be good, because then, back to your example, let's take Aleph Alpha or Mistral, the French and German startup. Right now, they would, of course, need to fulfill existing copyright laws. They would need to fulfill existing product safety legislation that is applicable in this case. Of course, even other contractual law and so on is applicable, but 28B would not apply to them until they are fulfilling certain threshold. How those thresholds are looking like, we are still not knowing. Your colleague Scott, I think he's also here, was working, for example, on one essay where he was thinking a little bit more about how those thresholds could look like. But yeah, in the end, one, I think, feasible approach would be that the Commission then is further specifying these thresholds, and then they would look, Aleph Alpha in my case, or Mistral, are still not that powerful, the models, or are still not having such a high user number, like, for example, ChatGPT and so on, so they are not reaching the threshold. Therefore, at least the AI Act, or at least this 28B, is not applying to them. But if they are reaching the threshold, it would. I think it would help, because then they would have time to grow, to also to learn a little bit how to become compliant, because even if they are not under 28B, of course, many of their consumers, especially business consumers, will already tell them, okay, look, we know you are not there yet, but we as your customer, we would feel safe if you are already trying to reach, for example, the requirements on data governance. So I think there is a market pressure to fulfill 28B, even though you are not there yet. But by not having the legal obligation to fulfill those things, we as Parliament, there I can speak for really cross-party impression, think that it's a better approach, because again, it would allow a slower way to become fully compliant.
Yeah, this allows me to hook in on some of the questions that are already appearing in Slido. And there's a question
I think very similar. It's definitely one option. I think in the European Parliament, our parliamentarians feel that code of conducts are not enough in this case. And you mentioned it at the very beginning. AI is triggering a lot of fears, and especially the example from the Netherlands, our Green colleagues, one of them is coming from the Netherlands, Kim van Spaantag. For her, it's really one of the driving fears that for her is really connected to artificial intelligence, and she and her office I think they really don't feel comfortable with a situation where something so powerful like GPT-4 or Claude or others would not need to fulfill certain, at least, information obligations, so that in your example, that it's clear what kind of data is being used, on what kind of data this model is being trained, why certain decisions could arise in the end. And yeah, this, I think, again, cross-party generated the conclusion in the European Parliament, no, this is something too important, too powerful, and therefore needs to be regulated. And codes of conduct didn't always work super well in our experience. And yeah, therefore the majority, or it was kind of really cross-party understanding, was saying, no, this we should do. But even though 28B will never be too specific, so it's still at least based then on guidance, on guidelines, on benchmarking, on metrics, hopefully then developed by the AI office, where also civil society companies will have a big say. The standardization bodies will be hugely involved, the commission with guidance, and so on and so on. So it's not like that now the co-legislator is putting an extremely specified and detailed list of requirements out. It's still rather broad, I would argue.
Okay. Jeremy, coming back to what you said on copyright, in a previous life you worked for the European Digital Media Association, where no doubt your daily work was all about dealing with those video, audio industries and all that. And you mentioned the copyright directive and the text and data mining exception that was built into this. My question is, and again comparing with the US, in the US you have this transformative use on copyright, which allows researchers or companies to use copyright protected material, provided they do something different with it than what the original purpose was. Our text and data mining exception in Europe doesn't go that far. First of all, it puts limits on commercial use of text and data mining. And secondly, we haven't really fully adopted this transformative use approach. So wouldn't it be better to simply say, we offer no copyright protection when it comes to the use of those copyright protected materials for the training of AI. We offer copyright protection when it's for the output side, when it substitutes and competes with existing music and films and all that. But on the input side, it would really give a much stronger boost to AI if we would open it all up for transformative use for training models.
Listen, I can say that there have been other jurisdictions in the world that have gone down that path, Japan in particular, where they really are trying to emphasize the importance of that availability of data for the entire ecosystem, exactly the startups that you mentioned and others. It creates clarity and really encouraging folks to leverage the publicly available data for exactly that kind of transformative or non-consumptive use, right? So I think there's those that certainly agree with you around the world. That would certainly provide a degree of certainty, and it's a more progressive approach that would encourage, again, much of that development. Remembering what that debate was like in the context of the copyright directive, there still are different business models in Europe, whether it's database models, journal subscriptions and the like. There's content that has been made available under certain conditions. And I think the balance that was struck in that, and there was progress that was made along the negotiations, was allowing those models and some of those players to have the possibility to opt out. But that model then wouldn't be the default for everyone. So that's where the balance was struck. If there's no indication or reservation of the right, it is available to read and learn from. Some people used to say the right to read is the right to mine. I would say the right to read is the right to learn. And I think that's helpful clarity for any startup. The short answer to your question is I think a lot of people would agree with you that that would be a good approach. I think based on where the discussions were in Europe around that time and where discussions are now around generative AI, I think we need to see where that conversation goes. I will say it's important to keep that in mind, and it was something that came up during the copyright directive where the research community in Europe was clamoring for such legal certainty around the exception because other jurisdictions were able to do more with their access to scientific journals and research publications than researchers were in Europe. So what started out as a very limited exception for research and nonprofit expanded because of the opportunities presented by AI and because of the partnerships with private and public institutions and researchers and commercial operations. So I think it made a lot of progress. I think it's still, given where that debate was, it was a healthy and good result for Europe. As we look at generative AI and the promise thereof and the way other jurisdictions are going, that conversation will come back. I think the balance that was struck, though, was one that at least respects, as many different players in the system as possible. And I don't know whether Europe has the same appetite for some of the more progressive approaches that you mentioned.
Hinda, coming back to you, you said, well, these generative AI models are heaven for marketing people because it makes their life much easier. And so there are some questions in Slido about the impact on work, of course. How do you see that, let's say 5 years from now or 10 years from now? With every new technology that comes up, there's of course this scare about what will it do to our jobs. And we've had that ever since the Industrial Revolution, I think so. But we also see that over the last centuries, despite all major technical revolutions, the amount of work keeps increasing.
Yep.
So are you optimistic, pessimistic about the impact on work?
I am rather optimistic for two reasons. I think one is, in general, these type of AI models or systems, they've also raised the question of data literacy, right? So we talk a lot about AI, but AI is kind of, the end game. And we first need to make sure that people in any type of position, whatever your job is, they need to have some basic understanding of data, and they need to be able to understand insights from data analytics, right? Like from visualizations, like if you read the news and you read about the economy, like do you actually understand what you're seeing? So it just kind of raised this issue that what we're realizing a lot of folks are not ready for this AI revolution. And I see a lot of companies and public organizations as well kind of investing more and more in data literacy. So they're really realizing that we need to give the foundations to people, which also means that they're going to be able to benefit from these AI technologies in their day-to-day job and possibly make them more meaningful. So, of course, we talked about the risks and challenges of these types of models, but we also know that they can reduce the time that is required for some uninteresting, repetitive tasks, right? Like, I don't know how many people here can tell me that they love making slides, or we have to as part of our job for most of the time, right? So imagine if we could focus on the content of the slides, throw in a couple of ideas, and then not worry about, what it sounds like, or like if the English is good enough. That's another, I think aspect to think about. We live in a, at least Brussels is a very international city, like nobody thinks twice about speaking English, but we also need to think of opportunities when you work with people from the other side of the world. Like, wouldn't this open also an opportunity to, speak in different languages and still understand each other? And that shouldn't be as tedious as copy-passing emails in Google Translate, right? Like, it just opens a lot of opportunities for exchange, for communication. And I really believe, so that was my second point, is it would make a lot of our, tasks more meaningful. It will help us shape our jobs in a more meaningful way. At least that's my hope, right? Like, I work a lot for corporations. I used to be, working for, big pharma companies, and most of what I did was writing reports for people that would never read those reports, right? And that was 80% of my time. And I didn't do science. I didn't make machine learning to help with the vaccines. Most of my work was making sure that the so-called C-level people would actually have the information that they needed in the right time. So if I could have automated that task, right, I could have spent time actually building models that would have improved the supply chain, actually what they hired me to do, right? And I think that it will make a lot of jobs more meaningful, but we also need to be careful in not creating, these kind of jobs are not meaningful. Like, if you think about how these robotic arms in the warehouses that retailers use, they need human support to operate. And I don't know if you've seen that. If you can look that up online, you see this huge robotic arm moving from side to side to fill in orders. And sometimes it drops stuff. And when it drops stuff, you have a human that has a light that goes off in a tablet, and they have to run and pick it up for the robot, so that so the order is complete. I don't believe that's a meaningful job. And if you talk to the people, they can tell, I spend my day running, and I liked my job before better because it was a meaningful job. I actually would see the orders. It just felt a bit more fulfilling. So this is not necessarily something that is positive in terms of technology implementation. But I think that for a lot of the, let's say, corporate type of jobs, I think it will probably be positive. And then we need to see this as an opportunity for data literacy, which I think is lacking in a lot of places. And I'm going back to the example of the Netherlands. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of the scandals that we had about the use of AI technologies, the misuse of these AI technologies stems from a misunderstanding of how they should use and how to validate them. So it's really a problem of data literacy. So the people who acquire the services of external parties that came in and said, yes, this AI is amazing, it's going to help you automate your whatever task you're doing, and people don't question because they don't have basic data literacy skills and they don't have critical thinking. So I think this is an opportunity for us to, this is the time now to invest in that.
Thank you. There's still a couple of questions popping up on the regulatory impact of the AI Act. Kai, with the GDPR, we created in Europe this sort of what is called the Brussels effect. So because we were the first to enter in this domain of personal data protection, and other regions and countries in the world were sort of watching us, what was going on. And when they saw, well, this may be not a bad idea, slowly other countries came up and imitated the EU in that respect, and even the US and California, the state of California, created its own Privacy Protection Act. Do you expect that the AI Act might have a similar sort of Brussels spillover effect into other parts of the world? Because that might be a way of avoiding that it drives AI research and investment out of the EU and into other parts of the world if we get a sort of regulatory level playing field, at least among major countries in the world. That would be a wonderful effect. So how do you see the future of if that AI Act gets adopted, how it would work out in the longer run?
Yeah. So my boss Axel Voss and myself, we are sometimes at least coming across rather critical about the AI Act, but we still believe there is a real chance for a second Brussels effect. And really to underline here that the team of Kilian Gross in the European Commission did really very, very good work with their draft proposal from 2021, because it was really not like a new invention from the European Commission, but it was very much drawing back on internationally accepted principles that were or have been developed by the OECD, by UNESCO. They were in close contact to Council of Europe, and so on and so on. So we have a lot of prep work internationally accepted from the whole or most of the international community that was then going into the AI Act and, for example, created this Article 10 on discrimination, data governance, or transparency, human oversight. Those things, again, are not an EU invention, but are really those core elements that you hear in basically every international paper from international organizations on this topic. And I think if we as European Union manage in the end to have an AI Act that is really sticking very close to those core principles, then there is a really big chance that we have a Brussels II effect, like Vestager and von der Leyen and others are so much hoping for, because it's then also rather easy for, let's take Japan or Brazil or even Canada and so on, to at least cherry pick certain elements that might also fit in their legal system. And this is actually, in this Brussels effect 1.0 example, I think it's sometimes a little bit exaggerated because, for example, in California, they didn't copy-paste the whole GDPR. No, they cherry-picked. So they took what I just said, they took elements that were making sense for them, for the Californian system, and took it over. And the same applies, again, to Brazil, to a lot of other countries. And yeah, going back now to the point that I was making, if we are really sticking close to these core principles and not making too much unique European additions or changes, that would make it rather complicated for other third countries to implement those new provisions in their law, then we have a real chance. One thing I said already, if we are not making it too unique and European, one thing that, of course, is a little bit a threat to this Brussels II effect, if, for example, and we were even proposing it, we added new principles, general principles for all European AI systems based on the high-level expert group here in Brussels. Those principles, I would say, are still in line with internationally accepted principles, but again, there is a risk due to input from certain political actors that it's going very far away. And this would then also collide, and this is why I took this example of general principle, it would collide with international standardization, technical standardization, because also there we have a lot of prep work and a rather clarified, let's say, majority opinion worldwide. And if now we have a law that is not in line with that, and then Senelec is kind of forced to develop European harmonized standards that are not in line with the ISO standards, so the worldwide standards, not only Microsoft has a big problem, but also European smaller companies that need to stick to these European standards. But then if they want to sell it in, let's say, Asia, they would completely need to reconstruct the whole system. So there is hope for Brussels II effect, but there is still also a big risk.
Yeah. We are nearly coming to the end of this session. There are a couple of questions about very particular applications of AI. I would just want to pick up one for you, Jeremy, which is on education. Somebody suggests, well, if we want to have people better prepared to work with AI, we need also to change the education system. Microsoft is very active in educational software for schools, offering teachers and students many tools. It collects loads of data from these schools. Now, do you see any scope for using these data, plugging them into generative AI models, and these generative AI models becoming helpful tools to teachers and to students to improve their educational performance, turning it into something positive that makes students and teachers better prepared for professional applications?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that's going to become increasingly important, because I think the younger generation and, even, well, my generation and others, you're going to be using this more and more. And I think, coming back to what I said earlier, I think those that are most successful are going to be those that are able to leverage these tools most effectively, but who also have the ability to check the veracity and the accuracy of these, to know what the weaknesses are and where the shortcomings might be. So there's going to need to be education, both in how you use the tools and how you check the tools, and, reliability of these tools. So I worry about situations where somebody thinks they can just ask generative AI a question and the output that comes out is done, and you turn it in. I don't think that would be good for education, and I don't think that would be good for anyone, and I don't think those will be the winners. So I think there's education all around. One part of your question, I don't think it would be a good idea, and I think we make commitments along these lines. I don't think we'll be successful in that space if we're seen as providing educational software that is collecting data and training the models. Most of these models are trained on separate data sets and made available for use. We have enterprise customers that are very concerned about their data being used to train, and we offer solutions dedicated to enterprise education and elsewhere, where there are contractual technological commitments in place to make sure none of that data is being used to retrain or train the model in the first place. I think it is important, though, to learn from teachers that are using these tools what's working and what's not. So if you think about data in that sense, we always want to have that conversation, and we build those tools in combination with educators and researchers to find out what's working best in the classroom. What are students responding to? We talk a lot about prompt engineering. You can tell that term came from engineers, right? But it's really queries. What type of questions are you asking these things? How do you expect to get the right answer? So there's a lot of education that needs to go on around that. And I personally think there's a lot of education that needs to go on around knowing what the answers are and how they could be improved. If you think about the way I use it, even in my office, I ask it a question about sustainability. My sustainability colleague, I'm pretty impressed with the answer. They'll say, well, they've left out this, they've left out that. That could be a little bit built out. It's still amazing, because now she can go on top of that answer, complete it, save time, and provide a really effective output. But if you're just relying on that and turning it in, whether you're doing legal work, whether you're doing industrial work, health applications, and education, we get into much more sensitive data sets. I think you need to have somebody with the education levels and awareness to check the veracity of these things.
Thank you. With this, I think we've come to the end of this debate. Thank you very much to our panelists for this very insightful discussion. Thank you to the audience for being here. I hope you enjoyed this debate, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the Bruegel annual meeting. Thank you.